Hello, everyone. Happy almost end of the week, and thank you all for joining us for our Shockwave Talks. My name is Patrick Canning. I am from Erudit, which is a new AI powered people analytics solution that believes in better people data for better decisions. Here at Erudit, we love learning, and this webinar series is a reflection of that, where we get to deep dive with HR experts and industry leaders from around the world. And luckily, today we have one. This specific episode is about cleaner data for more reliable people analytics. But before I introduce our guest and before we get started, I would just like to do some basic housekeeping. First, we're trying to keep this event under an hour. You can feel free to ask questions in the LinkedIn chat at any point in time. I will be reading them and asking them. After each slide, we will dedicate a short period of time to asking a few questions. And at the end, we will have a longer, more open-ended Q&A. Last thing, we are also recording this. So if you'd like to watch this again, or if you'd like to share, we'd be happy to send you the link after. Once again, thank you all for taking the time to join this conversation. Now, I would like to formally introduce you all to Giuseppe DeFazio.
Hello, Patrick. Thank you for
Uh,
having me.
yeah, hello, Giuseppe. How are you doing today?
Good, good. Thank you. Thank you. How are you?
I'm doing great myself. So, for all of you who don't know, Giuseppe is the Director of People Analytics and Workforce Planning at Silicon Valley Bank. I believe you have a bit over a decade of experience in HR across various different industries. And yeah, your specializations are in data architecture, workforce analytics, and people ops, one of the reason which is one of the reasons why we are very lucky to have you. So first off, yeah,
Thank you.
thank you for taking the time to have this conversation with us.
Absolutely. It's a pleasure.
Yeah, so yeah, everyone, please give a warm welcome to Giuseppe.
Hey, Patrick. I think the main topic for today that we want to touch on was really the clean data, why it matters, what can we do to make it clean and keep it clean. And I thought that the very first point was really more about why does it matter? Why do we want to have data that is clean? And of course, the three main things are really the ones that are on the slide here. We might have incorrect beliefs, assumptions, and insights on the status of our workforce or some of the data within our company. So that would also lead to decisions that are poorly informed and that are not actually in the best interest of the company. And of course, in general, if we use data that's not accurate, that damages trust in the overall analytics process, in the dashboards, in pretty much all the data that we have. I can give you a couple of examples where I've heard many times, oh, we usually have a high turnover after we pay out our annual bonus. So we need to maybe change the payout schedule to make sure that we don't have this spike because that causes disruption for talent acquisition and a bunch of different things. If you don't have clean data that ties the payout structure to your turnover, you might just think that's the case, but it isn't. Or other examples, it's cheaper for us to hire in location X versus location Y. And again, they might be true, it might not. You might not have looked at the levels that you're hiring and the composition of the workforce in different locations. So again, going back to assumptions that might not be exactly what's true, and the damaged trust in the analytics process. This is the sentence that we never want to hear. That starts with, "Oh, I think there's something wrong with the data," and usually that's followed by, "I don't know if this is accurate," and then it goes, "Oh no, I cannot trust this analytics." So everything that you prepared it just falls apart because the perception of accuracy becomes paramount. So you really need to invest the time, not just to have the data clean, but to make sure that the leaders and people that consume the data really feel that the data can be trusted. And you can be very explicit about the process that you do to keep it clean, to make it clean. Um, it's not secret sauce. There's a lot of hard work behind the scenes, but that really creates the trust so that
Yep.
you're not gonna have the 100% data clean all the time, but at least people understand that it's gonna be really, really clean. So that's
Yep.
really important. And those are the big three things why having clean data is really important.
Yeah, that does make a lot of sense. So, taking a step back, Giuseppe, I was wondering if you could help us understand the bigger picture of your position. I'm just, curious, like what kinds of data sources do you work with? And in those data sources, what the actual data is, and with that data, like what are you trying to figure out? What kinds of, questions are you trying to answer?
I worked directly with a lot of different data sets, mostly about employees. Your regular HRS data about the employee,
Yep.
the structure, some of the personal data. We usually is not we don't use that much. The cool part is that when you start integrating data sets from your performance review system, or maybe your employee survey, employee sentiment system, the of course the compensation part. If you're a public company, of course, equity and everything that goes with shares, investing.
Yep.
So once you start building with that, you can see a fuller picture of your workforce. And
Yeah.
of course, there's a travel data in your HR in your just the data itself on which departments are receiving people from which groups and what is the usual career path from
Yep.
engineer to senior engineer to director of engineering, for example, right? And you can see what's the average time in the steps to get there, which is
Right.
also good for employees' perspective of, okay, these are my potential paths. This is what happened in the past to people that get there. And also you can have a chat with the people that got there. So, okay, this was my path to get there, which is not always the same for everybody, of course.
Right.
But as an employee, you get a sense, oh, these might be my options. So it's also
Yeah.
value for the employees, and not just for the company on using the data. But again, it has to be clean, standardized. We'll get through that, but that's a big part of it.
Yeah. Yeah. That does make a lot of sense. I'm just curious, what are some of the most common examples of dirty data that you tend to encounter?
Our duplication is a big one. I know we'll
Uh,
cover it later. It's really the fact that a lot of times, especially employee data, some basic name, last name, email address, that kind of stuff, is entered in multiple systems by multiple people and updated multiple times, and then goes to the social truth, which will be your HRIS. Like
yep.
here in the US, for example, right, the employee fills out their data when they do the employment application. And then sometimes they do it again on their first day. And then they do it
Yep.
again when they sign up for their 401k. And then they do it again, if the system is not communicating with each other, when they do the insurance for health insurance. And sometimes for life insurance. So there's
Yep.
multiple data systems and sets they cover the same thing. And that's really, you see just the duplication, the formatting, that's usually a very big one. And once you address that, it just cuts off the volume of the data set
Yep.
you're working with. And that helps quite a bit.
Yeah, because I can only imagine, with there being a lot of different redundancies and from different data sources. Yeah, I can definitely see that being a common issue. I know you did talk a little about this, but I was wondering if you had a few more examples from in your experience of when leaders have made, bad decisions based off of bad data.
I can give you an example on so-so decision based on missing data or data that was incomplete. I went through a merger a few years ago, and of course, we announced the merger. We couldn't close it the same day. And one of the things that happened is, of course, the target company started to lose people. There were concerns about retention of key
Yep.
employees. And now, industry standard, you promise retention bonuses. You invest some money to address the fact that, of course, people might think, oh gosh, I'm gonna lose my job, and that's pretty
Yeah.
normal, right? The fact that we started doing this without having a clean picture of employees payout for the next 12 to 18 months meant that we might have promised cash payments to someone that maybe they were vesting kind of the same amount in stock a week before, or we took a quick and dry approach for everyone that was on the absolutely keep list. But
Yep.
that not having a full picture on bonuses, special bonuses, and all of that, we couldn't get a good sense of that. So it was the best we could do with the data we had. But once you have the better data, we thought, okay, we need to build this, a bit better. So next time around, we're
Yep.
going to have better data to make to use for our decision making. So
Yeah, of course. Yeah, that does make a lot of sense. Okay, so I feel like, we have established, a lot of the issues with, having bad data and how can that lead to negative outcomes. So my question to you is, so yeah, now we have the bad data. So how do we convert that into clean data that can be usable and digestible?
Um, I think there's really three major steps in looking at the data you have, and this is more the process of data cleaning. Some people call it data scrubbing or just keeping a good data hygiene. And I really wanted to call out the definition, a more general definition of what it is. The data cleaning, fixing, removing data that might be incorrect, inaccurate, incomplete, inconsistent, duplicative, or just formatted the wrong way. And we'll talk about what the wrong way is. And usually this happens, user error, poor communication across departments. We talked about, putting the address format in different ways because different teams don't talk to each other that much. Coordination, or just sometimes the process is there's no vetting in between, and then just there's some issues there. I think everything really starts from the data assessment. And this is where we look at the data we have and look at, okay, so where is data coming from? How is it used? What are the technologies that we use? What are the processes, the people that enter the data, manage the data, manipulate the data throughout for the employee, at least from when they apply to the job until well after they have left, right? This helps also understanding the root cause of some data quality issues. We get a better understanding of the problems, and then this becomes more like a reinforcing a good feedback loop where at the end when you do the auditing and monitoring in the third category, you go back to, oh, maybe this is something that's recurring because of the process that we looked at during the data assessment step. So that's really the big chunk of it. And then I know I have a little slide more about how you decide what data is good and what is not. The second category is really more the data remediation, which is more the chunk of what we're talking about today. So just really fixing it. I'm assuming that your data has some major issues, so that's the few steps where you can take, just go through the process of fixing the data. And the third category, once the data is 99.99% clean, is just how do we monitor it? How do we make sure that it stays clean as you imagine new hires, people leaving, people joining. Data about employees is never the same. It changes every minute. So having good processes on just keeping a good monitoring and auditing the data is very important. So those are the three big things. So yeah, I think those are the three things that we can touch on today.
Yeah, at least a question that I had, I'm, curious when you're getting your, hands dirty, hands on the data. I'm just curious about what kinds of tools or programming languages that you use to actually execute that data cleaning process.
I'm an Excel fan. Where that's allowed, meaning
It's the
if you have
classic.
100,000 rows, that becomes a bit an issue, no matter
Yep,
how powerful your machine is, right? Uh,
very
but
true.
if it's a reasonable amount, and I would say reasonable, probably below 5,000, 10,000, that's still okay. Depends how many columns you have, right?
Yeah.
There are some tools that I really like that are, once you set up more these are the parameters, these are the acceptable values. There's some software that can just help you figure out, okay, this is an outlier, this is formatted differently. That can help automate some of that.
Yep.
But I usually spend a very large amount of time just understanding each field and
Yep.
understanding why is it used and how it's used downstream, because that's also another
Yep.
piece that I
Yep.
don't know if we're going to touch today, but it's really sometimes we clean up our data, is great, and then we simplify the field because we thought, okay, that's cleaner, but there was a system downstream from us that actually needed that complexity in that field to do some other process. And now we kind of have to go back or negotiate with that person that uses that system. Okay, we're going to do it a different way, or how can we simplify everybody's life with cleaning while keeping a good formatting and consistency across. But yeah, it's usually I prefer just fingers on keyboards and just looking at every single field if it's a manageable set.
Yep. Yeah. Of course, that's very understandable. So Giuseppe, earlier, I believe on the last slide, you mentioned that you're ingesting data from various different
Yes.
sources, and of course, there's an element of human data entry, and especially with text data, which can really
Yes.
be a pain. I know all too well. How do you ensure that all of the data is standardized and that you're using the same definitions for things?
A lot of politics. No, just kidding. Well, some part of that, but it's really to build what I called here a data dictionary. Can people call it a glossary? Is really a document. Sometimes it's kind of like a book where all the different stakeholders came together and decided on specific definitions and what is what. I'll give you the example here. Is really more about two different sections and what I'll call it for all elements. It's really a consistency guide to make sure that some things apply to all concepts and metrics, dimensions, attributes that you might have, and then something specific for each, right? In the first section that applies to all elements, there's really two pieces that I felt are really, really key. One is a naming convention. And I give you here the example, do we call this thing turnover annualized rate or annualized turnover rate? That changes things also for the future. If you start adding metrics and other concepts, your team is not the only one that can do that, as other teams need that. They already can use that nomenclature the right way. Plus, when you sort, when you filter, when you search, when you group things, it's a lot easier if the different pieces of the name of the thing or element are very clear. The second part that should really be standard across, and that you might encounter some system issues where some systems cannot exactly match what you want. So in the API or in the file, there's going to be some transformation from one system to your data lake or whatever you keep the source through, right? So that it transforms into the shared format. But this is more about really capitalization policy, how many decimals we have in digits that have decimals, what's your date format, what's the first day of the week? Is it Sunday, Monday, or something else? It seems sometimes mundane, but that changes quite a bit. If you look at something by week, of course, knowing what's the first day of the week is important, and it should be the same across. And then if you look at the second category, which is really a little guide for every single element that we have, and then of course a detailed definition of what that element is, and detailed explanation of how is that calculated, and ideally you have like an example for each. One example that I've been working on the last few weeks that's been very interesting is how do we count turnover, in the sense of how many people have left the company this month, which should be just a simple count, but it isn't, because some systems define a person that turnover as an effective date being the last day they worked. Some other systems define it as the first day they have not worked, which is all great if you look at the monthly data, except for the last day of the month, where some systems will put those terminations in the following month and some will not. So having consistency in the definition expectations of what are the rules on the effective date for terminations, which impacts your headcount as of end of month, which is a metric that you can find everywhere, that changes things quite a bit. And then the thing that's really important for the validation and keeping the data clean is really what is the valid output for each element, right? So categorical data or text data, like you mentioned, what are the data labels that are acceptable? And then for numerical variables, what are some data ranges that are acceptable for each element? And of course, this dictionary is not a static document one and done and use it all the time, because of course your company's policies might change. You might have new dimensions. If you add a new data set, that might come, well, should come with new categories that you add into your data lake. And of course, compliance with laws and regulations that change all the time. Here in the US, EEOC, fair hiring rules about ethnicity, and there's a lot of different rules for that. Of course, in the EU, GDPR being a big part of it. And of course, now there should be an attachment to this, which is more of your data retention policy for each of these elements. How long are we going to keep these? What happens if we receive a request for deletion? Which fields we're going to delete? Which fields we can mask without deleting, or should mask without deleting? Otherwise, we're going to break down a bunch of historical data or some algorithm that does something if you start taking little Lego blocks away. So that's also part of the data dictionary. But that should be your guide on this is how we define things, and that's why it's called dictionary. like, like our words, right? Although they change all the time, and the dictionary is changing all the time.
I know it's really funny because when you get to this level, you honestly sometimes feel like you're a lawyer trying to, argue with
Yes.
a judge. It's like, oh, what's the first day of the week? Or like
Yes.
even dealing with like date times. There's the American, version, which in my opinion is the correct one, and then there's the European one, which is wrong. But I know a lot of my coworkers are probably gonna hate me for that, but uh,
It all depends. It all depends. Well, what's the time zone of the company is a funny one, right? So the timestamp, right?
yep.
When did something happen? So that's also
Yep.
anyway.
If only we all just use Unix time, but I don't think that's
No, I don't think we will go for that. You remember Swatch in the '90s tried internet time, like a day divided by 1,000 steps, but I think didn't
oh
take long.
yeah, that's very funny. So I guess a question that I have for you here, as someone who is in like workforce planning, I would assume you have to deal with a lot of different stakeholders and a lot of different departments. What
Yes.
are like some departments that you have to communicate and standardize this data dictionary with?
I would say finance is one of the major ones, mostly because of reporting, especially if you work for a public company. There's a lot of reporting that has to be done to the street, that has to be done to investors. And of course, going back to the discussion I had before, look, what's the headcount as of end of the year? That might change things, especially for the contingent workers, where usually the contract ends at the end of the month, regardless of the day of the week. So that's one. So I would say finance tends to be one. With the our friends in IT and HRIS, sometimes it's more about the technical parts or whatever system you're using and the limitations there, and how can we manipulate some of the data from one system to another to make sure that the output and the formatting is correct. But that's more on the technical side. But I would say the finance team in the US right now depends how the company structure. Sometimes the DNY team is under HR, sometimes it's not. And of course, there's a lot of importance about keeping the data private and secure. only a few people can access it, also in aggregate, right? So there's a lot of that, but it becomes more a security kind of thing. Although some of the definitions, going back to the dictionary, right, about in the US, again, how do you define ethnicity and race? What are we tracking? There's quite a few things where the company policy impacts how you gathering the data. A few years back, for example, there was this visual test where if someone does not check the box on ethnicity, the company was supposed to just look at the person and pick one or more, and that was the way to go. And then now it changed, and some companies decide if someone doesn't respond, we just leave it blank. That's our best effort. So there's also some regulations that can sometimes conflict with each other. So sometimes you can add legal involved. Just make sure that your data dictionary and the way to gather and update the data is also compliant. So I would say those are the teams.
Yeah, that definitely does make a lot of sense. So, my final question for you is I was hoping you could walk us through the process. So we now
Yes.
have communicated with all of the departments, especially finance, and we've now standardized a data dictionary so everyone can be on the same page. So what are the next steps
Yes.
after that?
Well, now we need to fix the thing. I put there like four buckets of actions. And ideally there will be steps that you take sequentially. Although the first one, which is a very important one, probably you need to take like a little bit of that also at the end, and I'll explain why. So I will really start with the removing the duplicates part. Again, we talked about this, multiple sources, tracking similar data. Um, Sometimes, yeah, there will be a pay change, and that's in HRIS because the transaction was approved by the boss in HRIS, but also in the payroll system, because of course that's where that change takes place and is in the real world. So you might have two transactions for the same thing, right? The other reason that I like to do this first is really the data set size can significantly shrink before you move to the next steps. Uh, uh, but sometimes some of the duplicates might not become evident until after you did some of the formatting or fix some of the structural errors. So that's why I'm saying it might be like number one and number five. But usually, I start at the beginning with this is a good way to go. Word of caution on the duplicates is that sometimes some duplicates have a reason to exist in some data sets, especially if we're only using a handful of fields. An example could be there's an employee that's hired in January, the person resigns in April, and we hire again this person in October. If we're looking at the list of employees hired year to date, this person is going to show up twice, and we might think, oh, this is a duplicate. If we don't have the field that shows you the actual hire date for that event, but only the year, we might think that's a duplicate. So sometimes adding new fields while we're doing the duplication removal process is useful to understand some of the entries might not, or records might not be duplicates, but they have a reason to exist. After that, I really try to go with the structural errors. This is where you look at typos, formatting, conventions, going back to the data dictionary, trying to make sure that we're spelling something the same way. If you have like a foreign address with just characters that are not from the English language, how we're treating those, right? Do we use not applicable? Do we use NA, unknown? And that might be more a company preference. I was at companies where the word unknown would make people think that the data existed, we just didn't have it, or our team couldn't get it, versus not applicable, which was more neutral. Okay, this doesn't apply to this person. Let's move on, right? So that's really the number two, is really looking through that Excel spreadsheet if you can, or pivot tables if you can, and looking for typos, formatting, those kind of things. Then it's really more about the values, and this is more on the outliers, which would be the third bucket. This is where we talked about the acceptable ranges for each of the metrics or the elements. So outliers can be, numerical values that are much larger or smaller than other entries, or there's a conflict with the logic of some of the fields. Sometimes there's fields that have ranges that they're both satisfied individually, but then they conflict with each other. The textbook example is someone who's marked as part-time on the full-time versus part-time field, but then on the scheduled hours per week, this person has 40 hours, which at least in the US, that would be a full-time person, not a part-time person, right? So there's also those combined acceptable ranges or combinations that should need to be checked for outliers. And some outliers, again, most of them need fixing, but not all of them. Usually an outlier that's very evident is someone residing in one country and being paid in a currency from a different country. That's usually a mistake unless we're talking about an expat. In that case, maybe someone from the US with an assignment in Europe, maybe for 6 months, and they kept everything the same. This person's still being paid in US dollars on their US bank account. That'd be fine, but there will be some exceptions. But again, it will be an outlier, just worthwhile to review it. One of the things that I really like to do is to create a dashboard that shows impossible outliers, or using filters that should give you a population of 0. One example would be someone who has a last promotion date earlier than their hire date, which is clearly impossible. Someone that has a negative value for tenure, or someone that on the performance score, where we give scores between 1 and 5, has a 7. Great performer, probably an outlier. And so I have this dashboard. I keep adding views, and when everything's good, the dashboard is clean. There's no data there because no entry satisfies those criteria, right? And that's just a good way for me to just do a quick audit to see there's no glaring outliers there. And the fourth bucket is the missing data, and this becomes more like a philosophical question and depends on the company how they want to handle this. Usually, I found out that most of the times contacting the person in charge of the data source is the ideal course of action. The data might still be missing because it was never gathered before, or because there's a specific reason and the person will tell you, and then you can figure out together how to deal with that part. Sometimes you might just want to integrate the data by inputting missing values. An example might be someone getting a pay increase, but you're missing the effective date of that pay increase. The same person got a promotion, and it kind of started around the same time, and you have an effective date for the promotion. Probably the dates are the same. Probably the two events were connected. In that case, I would suggest probably just you can supplement that date with the one from the promotion, or sometimes just leaving the value blank or not applicable or unknown, like we said before, might be worthwhile. In that case, I think a good step is usually to check for any other system that's dependent downstream again, or any algorithm, any automated process downstream that might be impacted by that. There might be like an API that doesn't recognize if you say NA, so just leave it blank, those kind of things. But those usually are the ways that I saw working with dealing with missing data works best.
Yeah, thank you very much for that in-depth explanation. I do have a question from the audience. Ignacio, he has a question for you. He asked, Giuseppe, what is your favorite people analytics tool that generates clean data?
Oh, wow.
It's a loaded question.
I have a favorite vendor. I really didn't want to publicize it, but I think there's quite a few that are very good at displaying data, to show clean data and to help you clean it. I don't know there's many that have that part already integrated. They're good enough to flag this might be wrong, this might be wrong. I've seen a couple of solutions where the user can flag to the admin a data point that says, "Oh, this seems wrong," which is going back to the thing at the beginning. I think this is wrong, but at least done through a system, and then they can flag that. You can go back to it. It's more like a systemized way of just crowdsourcing. This doesn't sound right, but a people analytics tool that at that level that flags you and helps you keep the data clean. I haven't seen one that makes me very, very happy. Higher in the stack when you're doing more specialized, it can be AI, it can be automation. Yes, there's a few that I think are worthwhile exploring, but I wouldn't call them people analytics tool because they really don't have that visualization part, and that's what I think.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that does make a lot of sense. So in terms of next steps, let's say we now have all of this data remediated, and
Mhm.
once it's done, what are the next steps? How do you ensure that it is done properly?
There's a few things that on the monitoring and auditing, and I think this is the last slide that I put there. These are really four concepts that you can also apply before you start the whole process. But I like them in the monitoring and auditing because whatever process you decide with some dashboards or some just pivot tables or creating some cadence where you look at specific fields where you know where the data might be wrong because you had issues there before. These four concepts kind of help drive that process. One is the validity. Is the data conforming to our rules and constraints? Are we measuring what we need to measure? And how did we measure it? Was there any biases measuring our data? Sometimes we have very clean data, but it's incomplete, and we don't even think about why it's incomplete or there's some collection bias. So it's less about the data that you have being clean and more about philosophical question on, do we have what we need to take action on it, or is just some good data but not all of it, right? So we're clear when we gather the data, were we consistent? Employee surveys, right? Like a team, we give them 3 days, and then your team, we give them 12 days. You're not going to get consistent data. So the data is going to look the same, it's going to look okay, but behind the scenes, something impacted how you gather the data. Accuracy, is it close to the true values? This is the example that I keep giving on this is the regrettable, non-regrettable for termination. I've seen huge swings of the percentage of even resignations that were regrettable or not based on feedback from above, based from incentives. If that percentage is part of your performance review, if you're a manager, that number tends to go down because you're the one that decides. So is it accurate in the sense of is it reflective of the truth, right? Completeness, this is going back to what we talked about before. Is all the required data known? An example is in the US, we need to know which US state you reside to get your full address. But that field in some other countries might be like a region. Is not needed, right? You have the city, you have the postal code. That's enough for the address. So the completeness part is going to vary based on the data set, based on the country, based on what you're looking at, and different pockets in the company might have different definitions of completeness, and that goes back to the dictionary again. And then consistency. Is data consistent within the same data set, across different data sets, and also if it's a yearly or annual data that you gather from year to year. And sometimes you change the way you measure things. Your employee survey from this year might have different scale from last year. Performance reviews, scales change all the time. But getting a sense of are we being consistent in the way that the data is gathered, maintained, and presented. Those four concepts are really the ones that drive the monitoring and auditing part. And the last step is really the one thing that's at the very beginning is creating a positive feedback loop, because in the end, as you clean up the data, you compile a list of sources or breakpoints while you fix them, and you try to figure out what caused the issue in the first place. This helps improve the process at the top, and is looking at data acquisition and the maintenance, any automation that you can put in place. It's usually great news. Ideally, you get a log of errors or a log every day of how things went. I think those are good tips on keeping the data clean, and just in general, keeping fingers off keyboards and usually using automation and APIs is a good way to go.
Yeah, always a very good point. Well, Giuseppe, thank you very much
Of
for your
course.
amazing presentation. We all do appreciate it. Just checking on time, we have about 20 minutes exactly for an open-ended Q&A. So for people in the audience, if you have any questions, feel free to jot them down. Feel free to jot them down now, and I'll be asking them. So first off, my first question, which I'm actually going to be building off, is from Alejandro.
Mhm.
His question to you is, how do you prevent bias on internal surveys? And my addition to that, which is kind of like a side tangent, is in your position, what role do surveys play in your job in understanding your workforce?
Bias in the survey is the first question. Internal surveys. Uh, on the gathering part, uh, you want a big N, right? You want a huge sample size. Ideally, you want everyone. No one's going to respond to all of that. Also based on how is the data gathered, if it's in person or not. You can have biases in the responses. So ideally, you want something that's anonymous, although that's going to kill a lot of the fields that you want to report on if it's really anonymous. But there's also a bit of a trade-off, especially if it's sensitive data. The other part about bias is really trying to figure out through statistical means. Look, some groups are going to be small, so your confidence interval is going to be fairly wide. And one of the things that I struggled with in the delivery of the data, especially for surveys, is this concept that some people score something 3.7 versus 3.4. Well, that was higher. Well, but you have a confidence interval that's, I don't know, 0.5. So they're not exactly the same, but probably, right? So that's something that it's more on the bias of the readers and not the employees that provide the data.
Mm, very good point.
But usually trying to get as many as possible is a good way to go. And then if you can, and if it's not fully anonymous, otherwise you cannot do this, try to see, at least for the big cuts, of location, teams, or any attribute that's important for that specific survey, that you have a good representation. Let's say you have two locations, one is Spain, one is France, and it's, let's say, headcount is 50-50, but responses are 70-30. You cannot aggregate the data. You shouldn't say, oh, company-wide, this is the number, because it's so skewed. You should probably try to figure out why response rates were much higher on one end versus the other. But I wouldn't even
Yeah.
report a company-wide number because there isn't one. Uh, so that would be my answer to the bias. Can you repeat the second part of the question, Patrick? I actually
Yeah,
forgot.
yeah. Sorry for bombarding you with the two-part question. My apologies. My addition to the question was, in your position, what role does survey data play in your position?
He has dependent on the company and also dependent on the topic. The more regular company sentiment, and at one of the previous companies we had, played a major role. First, in reshaping company culture, coming up with values, and using those values to create we called it a cultural committee of 25-30 people that met for about a few months to define them and also infuse those values into performance reviews and hiring and behaviors that were expected. So that was a big part. Other surveys, for example, through COVID, I had a different role. I was head of HR during that time, and of course, it was more about going to the office, working from home, what kind of issues you might have in terms of personal situation. Of course, there's a sensitive time for everyone. And then it was taken very seriously. It had to be not anonymous because we needed to know who needed help or adjustment in terms of hours and all that. But that really varied based on the type of survey and the circumstance of that survey.
Yeah, yeah, that does make sense. So piggybacking off this conversation, I see there's a comment from Taylor, and he asked, "What is a good response rate for internal surveys in your opinion?"
Oof.
It's a tough one.
Yeah, because it really varies,
Yep.
and also varies depending on your history on acting upon the results of those surveys. I was at companies where we did once a year, nothing changed, and people started doing it a bit less. So I would say probably between 30 and 50% is a good number. In some companies, I've seen 75%. It really depends on the topic. During COVID, the response rate was like 97%, of course. So it really depended. I would say anything below 30 is really disappointing. Between 40 and 60, I think it's fairly healthy. But again, it really depends on the topic, on the frequency, how much time you give people, the way to gather the data. If it's a one question survey or a 15 question survey. So, but yeah, 40 to 60 seems healthy to me.
Oh, that's very good to know. I have a question from Janine. This is more of like a personal question, not necessarily about work.
Okay.
But she said, working with data and with so much detail all day, do you ever feel overwhelmed or burnt out? And what do you do to rest, refresh, and stay sharp all week?
Oh, wow. Um, One thing that helps me is to always take a step back and look at the big picture. You have this big spreadsheet, but again, going back to how this data is going to be used and what's the purpose of this data. It's not just data being clean for being clean, and I really like the clean data and a clean spreadsheet, but more on what's the business rationale, how is the business going to use this, how is this going to help the company, the employees, also the purpose of it. I take breaks. I have my two huge monitors, and I take break once in a while. I just try to just look outside for a few minutes, and just even if I'm still thinking about work, at least I'm not staring at the screen, because of course that's also good for our eyes. And if I can take a walk, I try to take a walk for a few minutes. That's usually helpful. And also, if you can take a break and maybe finish work a little bit after dinner, spend time with the family or friends or your loved ones, that usually helps balance things.
Yeah. Yeah, at least for me personally, like I am a very big walker. I feel like at least for me, it helps to clear the mind and clear the soul, and
Yeah,
it's very
I
nice.
agree.
I guess my next question, with COVID having happened, or I guess we're still kind of in it too, how has your position and how have organizations changed with how they use data?
I think more and more. The last few years, as we all know, there was an explosion of data in all realms, and of course, the workplace and employees. It's even more. Um, and the fact that with COVID, we have even more data than before. I'll give you the example of ONA, organizational network analysis, where in the past, if you want to build a map of the organization, you could take a look at Outlook and see who's meeting with whom. If your phone system was tied to Outlook or to another system, you could just figure out who's calling whom roughly and get a good sense there. But some people may have real life meetings or walk by, right? So all the informal part or connections that happen at the workplace, they were gone during COVID, especially moving to a virtual setting. So a lot more data was created on Zoom meetings, who's pinging home, and a lot of Slack and Zoom, and so all those electronic interactions. There's just more and more. Uh, I don't think many companies have taken advantage of that in the sense of um, using that data to build a better view of the network and who's central, who's the connection between two teams. What I've seen that I really, really liked, and that's something that I know Microsoft is working for quite some time, is looking at your own specific use of Outlook and who you're meeting, the downtime, suggesting you should block these couple of hours, you should take some breaks, little nudges that in time, of course, Microsoft started working more and more with people analytics and employee data, active about LinkedIn and all that. So that's something that I really thought it's good for employees and for workers in general. Sometimes I get these little reports on, hey, you kept checking emails after 11 p.m. for 3 days straight. What's going on, kind of thing, right? So I think those are good uses of people analytics, of data points that can make everybody's life a bit better. Oh, Patrick, cannot hear you. Sorry.
Oh,
Oh,
sorry about
there you
that.
go. No worries.
It seems like I accidentally muted myself there. My apologies. I'm afraid, Giuseppe, we're coming up on time. Are there any last words that you would like to add before we end?
I just wanted to thank you for the opportunity to chat. This was really fun. I hope we can do it again in the future. Again, thank you for
Yeah,
having me.
I I hope so too. So to wrap things up, I'd just like to thank you, Giuseppe, for taking the time and effort to have this conversation with all of us. And I'd also like to thank the audience for all of your questions and for being here. And if you enjoyed this Shockwave talk, please join us for the next one, which is on October. Yep, there it is on October 13th with Gabby Hoyos from Notion. And that episode is going to be about building a culture of trust inside organizations. I'd like to give a special shout out to Sharda. Thank you for all of your support. I would also like to thank Janine. By the way, it's her birthday. Make sure to wish her a happy birthday. As well as Alejandra and Anna for organizing and making this event possible. Once again, my name is Patrick, and on behalf of Erudit, I would like to thank you all again for coming to this conversation, and I hope you all have a great day. Thank you.